Hi there guys, I hope you have had a good day. Now, Chris Eubank Jr., who is obviously training with Roy Jones Jr., is looking fast, his footwork is looking better, and there is a video that has emerged online of him throwing like 21 jabs consecutively and following his opponent back to the ropes. Now, obviously, something like that you can't really do in a fight. I mean, you can, but not against a higher level opposition because someone like Canelo will just step inside that and counter him. So he wouldn't be able to do that in there with someone like Canelo or Golovkin, but still, it's quite impressive to see how his footwork is looking better and his movement is as well. But there is still a long way to go for Chris Eubank Jr. because obviously in his last fight against Korobov, it wasn't the way he would have wanted to win that fight because Korobov had to withdraw because of an injury to his shoulder, and that fight was a bit cagey to begin with, but Chris Eubank Jr. was always going to take him late anyway. It wasn't going to be something where Chris Eubank Jr. goes in there looking for the knockout, looking to take him out early on. He was going to drag him late and see how Korobov deals with the pace that he sets later on in the fight, because Chris Eubank Jr. often doesn't tire in fights. The only time I've ever seen him tire is against George Groves, and that was because Groves was just pulling him around, and realistically for the whole fight, Chris Eubank Jr. was out of range. So he got a bit tired in that fight, but still, he still had enough left in him to have a big assault towards the end of the 12th round. So Chris Eubank Jr. wasn't going to tire in a fight with Korobov. Korobov might have. So tire him out, take him to the body. That's probably what the plan was for Chris Eubank Jr. They didn't get that far, so that's by no fault of Chris Eubank Jr. But who could he fight in his comeback, and how will he look against one of the top guys? Obviously, Canelo is still looking for an opponent at the moment. I don't believe it will be Chris Eubank Jr. I believe that it could be John Ryder, could be Callum Smith. Callum Smith said he wants that fight. He is happy to take it. Billy Joe Saunders has ruled himself out though. So it will not be Billy Joe Saunders who steps in there with Canelo in September. It could be John Ryder, it could be Callum Smith, it could be Murata, it could be even Derevyanchenko. Although Derevyanchenko looks like he could be fighting Charlo now. So we don't know who Canelo is going to fight in September. I don't think it will be Chris Eubank Jr. But that would be a good fight. I believe it would be. I believe that it will be all action, and Chris Eubank Jr. isn't going to box off the back foot. He's going to stand there and trade with Canelo. Now also there is the opportunity that he could fight Golovkin maybe down the line, although Golovkin is set to fight Zeremeta, I believe, who is his #1 challenger. So ultimately, next for Chris Eubank Jr. won't be Charlo, won't be Canelo, and won't be Golovkin. And maybe that's positive for Chris Eubank Jr. because while I do say that it would be a good fight between him and Canelo, it would be, you cannot deny that, standing toe-to-toe, it would not necessarily be a technical fight between those two, it's not going to be, but Chris Eubank Jr. will be there. Canelo will not have to go looking for him. That's why it will be an entertaining fight, standing toe-to-toe in the centre of the ring. So value for money, it would just be an absolute slugfest. That's why I believe it would be entertaining. But having that fight next maybe wouldn't be the best thing for Chris Eubank Jr. I believe that if he takes his time and develops, he could be in a place where he is in a stronger position to challenge in that fight. Because Chris Eubank Jr., he's always in shape, always willing to learn, I guess, under someone like Roy Jones Jr. Maybe that's the kind of trainer he needed, who had that history and a legend of the sport, because he will listen to him. So I believe that the link up between Chris Eubank Jr. and Roy Jones Jr. is a good one. I believe it works for Chris Eubank because, as I said, he will listen to him, and there is a wealth of knowledge that Roy Jones can pass on to Eubank. Now, obviously Roy Jones Jr. is going to be preparing for a fight with Mike Tyson in September himself. And I mean, that's not going to affect Chris Eubank Jr. at all, because obviously there are many other fighters on that farm, I think it is, that Roy Jones Jr. has. Eubank went there in the beginning of lockdown. He spoke to his dad and said that that's something he'd like to try. And I think that is the best thing that could have happened for Chris Eubank Jr. He says that he wishes he met Roy Jones earlier on in his career, when he was like in his early 20s, not in his early 30s. But I don't believe that really matters all that much, because the thing about Chris Eubank Jr. is he's always stayed in shape, and he's never, ever gone above 12 stone. So he's always in shape, always ready for a fight. He could fight at the weekend if he wanted to. Obviously, there are some technical misgivings that he needs to work on. There are some things that he needs to apply a bit more, better footwork and faster footwork as well. But ultimately I believe that Chris Eubank Jr. does have the making of a good fighter, and I know that he's no longer a prospect, but still, if he listens to Roy Jones, if he gets his technical work right, then he can be a good fighter. It's just whether he is willing to listen, and under Roy Jones, I believe he is. So what next for Chris Eubank Jr.? Well, obviously he's going to need not necessarily a tune-up fight, because I really don't believe in tune-up fights, especially someone who's coming off a win anyway. They don't need a tune-up fight. That was probably what his last fight was anyway, even though it was a tough fight. And fair enough for taking that fight, but still, I believe that he needs a live opponent coming back to the ring. The best fight, I believe, for him is David Lemieux, because Lemieux is a solid B-level fighter. He's no longer a world threat, not to the big guys, not to Canelo, Golovkin, or Charlo. He's not going to cause them enough problems to beat them anyway. He will cause them maybe a few problems early on because he has that power, but I don't believe that he can cause them enough problems to take the titles away from them and shock any of the champions. But what he can do is give Chris Eubank Jr. rounds. He can offer a tough test for Chris Eubank Jr. Say Chris Eubank Jr. stops David Lemieux, there is only going to be a big fight. After making a statement against someone like David Lemieux, Chris Eubank Jr. can say, I want Charlo, I want Canelo, I want Golovkin. He can say and demand he wants those fights, and he is a big name. He's drawing big interest from fans around the world in the sport of boxing. So there will be high demand for him to get in with one of those three, because it's only going to be a great fight. As I said before, even now, if he gets in with Canelo, it will be a good fight, entertaining. But I believe that Canelo does overturn him at the moment. But Chris Eubank Jr. needs to work on many things, get better, and make a statement against someone like David Lemieux. I'm not saying that Chris Eubank Jr. is going to beat Canelo, because at the moment it kind of seems impossible for, not impossible, but it seems like it's going to be very difficult to find anyone who can come close to beating Canelo, because he has that kind of aura of invincibility about him. But that must be taken away by one person. It was taken away by Floyd Mayweather, but Canelo was considered young, and let's be real, Canelo is a different animal now to what he was back then. A completely different fighter. So this invincibility about Canelo now has not been taken away by anyone. No one. And Canelo continues to win in top level fights. It's going to be a long time before anyone moves Canelo from that spot. And I'm not saying that Chris Eubank Jr. is going to be the one to do that, to beat Canelo. I don't believe at the moment Chris Eubank Jr. would beat Canelo. I don't believe that at the moment Golovkin would beat Canelo, because I think that if Golovkin was going to beat Canelo, it would have been in one of those two first fights. There were many claims that he did, but I believe that maybe now Golovkin is a little bit over the hill. So I don't know whether in a third fight with Canelo, Golovkin can do what he done in the first two fights. He does look different under Jonathan Banks, a lot different from Abel Sanchez. And I mean, in his last couple of fights, he hasn't looked all that brilliant. Against Derevyanchenko, I mean, it was a bit worrying at times in there. And he got hurt as well to the body. So Canelo will see that and go straight to the body against Golovkin. So is Golovkin the same fighter he once was? Maybe that's the better route for Chris Eubank Jr. Not because it's an easier fight. Well, kind of because it is. But ultimately, if he gets in there with Golovkin, I believe that he has a better chance than he does getting in there with Canelo. Because what's amazing about Canelo is he's had over, 50 fights, and he's still in his 20s. So Canelo still has a lot of gas in the tank yet going on into his career. He is still younger than Chris Eubank Jr. And look at what he has achieved in his career still. So Canelo is, I mean, he's just a general anomaly. He's someone completely different, and he's one of the legends of the sport. He will be. He's an elite level fighter, and I don't see anyone touching him anytime soon. But nevertheless, he can still be in a very entertaining fights with fighters like Chris Eubank Jr. Entertaining fights for the fans. Fights where they stand toe-to-toe. They don't have to go looking for one another. They stand there, they slug it out in the centre of the ring. That's why I believe that Chris Eubank Jr. versus Canelo would be an entertaining fight. Will it happen in September? I don't believe so, but I believe that if Chris Eubank Jr. is serious about this and he wants to make a statement, David Lemieux is a great fight for him to come back against in maybe September, maybe a bit later. But he does need to be a little bit more active than he has been in the last couple of years. Anyway, guys, what are your thoughts on this? Make sure you leave your thoughts in the comments below, leave a thumbs up, and subscribe if you are new. Thanks, guys.